Next, Sertat and Hatch's sister Guion were still processing entrants into the 430th Galactic Edible Plant Competition. The contest had been a successful one for many years, and already there were a few thousand entrants. Each species was allowed to submit only a single species of plant, as the judges from Serta and Guion's species had difficulty adapting to change, and too much variety could cause health complications. There had been some complaints about this, but it had generally worked out without incident previously, and apart from a few hiccups over some slight color and shape variations outside of the expected range, everything had gone quite smoothly. And then the humans had arrived. They were heralded at first by the bellowing of a transport barge. Most of the other species had arrived on group transports, carrying perhaps 100 or so individuals. The guidelines had not been so strict as to dictate how many entrants each species could submit, but gardening of any sort on such an industrialized world as the galactic capital meant a few hundred entrants from a given species was typically all that was seen. As they watched, the transport barge, one that appeared to have been salvaged and retrofitted from the last Ictat War, began to disgorge what appeared to be thousands upon thousands of humans. They were noisy, chattering, laughing and talking amongst themselves, the noise making Sertat's audio canals ache. He first hoped that perhaps the humans had just brought an inane number of supporters with them, but that was quickly dashed by seeing the sheer volume of plants, each individual carrying a planter. As he watched the crowd of humans swarming around his entry desk, Sertat felt a faint glimmer of hope at seeing the ridiculous variety of plants they had brought with them. Standing tall on his long, multi-jointed legs, he towered a dozen feet above the tallest human, filling his triple lungs to capacity as he bellowed a polite yet firm request for silence. The human hubbub died down to a dull murmur, not the silence he preferred, but enough to deliver his message. While we appreciate the enthusiasm of such newcomers to the Edible Plants Contest, he began, we must remind you that each species is allowed only a single plant species to submit, no more. We know, came a voice from the crowd. I beg your pardon? He stammered, bewildered. There were at least a dozen distinct plants, perhaps twice that many. Sertat observed everything from clumps of leafy greens the size of a human head to lumpy, misshapen green or white bundles, and even what looked like a craft project with someone hastily gluing of small leafy balls to a single stalk. This can't possibly be a single species, he exclaimed. Many of these are exponentially outside the bounds for size or leaf morphology comparisons alone. He leaned down and prodded one of the craft projects, makeshift clusters of tightly bunched leaves, each smaller than a human fist, attached to a wrist-thick stalk. I'm not even entirely convinced these are real plants. It's Brussels sprouts, said the human woman holding the planter defensively, her tone offended. Next to her, another gardener spoke up. We're well aware of the submission guidelines, the gardener assured him. These are all the same species. And why are there so many of you? Guion asked, her tone as baffled and concerned as Sertat's. One of the humans closest to them shrugged. Well, we looked at past entries and saw that each species had around 100 or less entries per cultivar. So we figured that was a reasonable upper limit for each of our cultivars. Cultivar? Serta repeated, hesitantly rolling the unfamiliar word around in his mouth. It didn't translate clearly in Sertat's universal earpiece whatsoever, but he knew he had to perform some due diligence instead of blindly allowing the humans to overwhelm the judging elders with their absurd spread of submissions. He fumbled around in his bag for an exam analyzer, finally finding it in a spare satchel pocket. Bracing himself, he began to take samples from each of the humans' plant categories. Each time, the exam reader confirmed they were indeed the same species. He even took several samples from the so-called Brussels sprouts, earning a dirty look from the woman over the minuscule holes left in the plant's balls and stalk. Finally, he finished, and the exam sequencer cheerfully confirmed that they were all indeed the same species. But why? Why go through all this effort of genomic manipulation, just to flood a contest with no prize other than recognition? Oh, you thought we did this in a lab? One of the humans said incredulously. Around her, the others laughed and chortled. Sertat shot a look at his hatched sister, who gave him a shrug and a nod. He asked uncertainly, how else would you have accomplished this? The woman holding the now confirmed legitimate Brussels sprouts stepped forward, gently patting one of Sertat's legs. "Oh, honey," she said. "We developed these before we even made it to space, and most of them before we'd even developed powered flight." Sertat blinked. "Well, that's unexpected," he said numbly. He and his hatched sister began checking in the humans, taking a brief moment to send a frantic message on his communications slate to the elder judges, praying they'd read it in time and be somewhat forewarned before being hit with such a deluge of variety. In the end, the message arrived too late. All of the 5 judges managed to survive the initial stress, but 2 retired, and 1 passed away shortly after the contest concluded, suspected to be in no small part due to the shock induced by the humans. Nevertheless, the humans won, with what was deemed to be the most aesthetically pleasing varietal cultivar they had submitted, something called a Romanesco. However, Sertat and Guillaume both agreed that the stress of the event had likely shortened their lives by years, maybe even a decade, and that they needed more relaxing work. Perusing the job openings board for their district later that evening, Guillaume was the first to notice an opening for event handlers and entry processors. "What's it for?" he asked her. "The Chunbri Companion Animal Contest," she replied. Sertat relaxing slightly at the thought that it was not a human-hosted event. The Chunbri had a similar mindset to their own, enjoying simplicity and straightforwardness. Companion animals, while an interesting choice, were an area their own species didn't engage with, though many others did. So it would be a nice change of pace, but not too much of a change. It appeared that the Chunbri were enforcing a similar requirement of only 1 species per entering species, which reassured Sertat. The humans might have made a mess of the plant contest with their so-called cultivars, but, he reasoned, that was with plants that lived for a single season and couldn't move. There was little chance they could cause similar issues with something as long-lived and active as a companion species.